me.
What's up, guys? Welcome into another edition of Bogey Free. We are coming at you with some general best ball strategy, but mostly here to talk about quarterbacks for this upcoming season. And Raymond Summerlin was gracious enough to join me this week. You can find him on Twitter at RM Summerlin. You can check out his work over at RotoWorld with the Draft Guide, among other things. What's going on, Raymond? How are we doing today?
Living the dream, my friend. How are you doing?
I have to say I'm pretty much doing the same, man. It's a Tuesday afternoon. I get to talk to you about some football. I can't really think of a better way to spend my Tuesday.
Well, I mean, I could probably think of some better ways. Like we could be on a golf course, or
True, fair.
I could be watching Black Klansman, which I haven't seen yet, and I'm really excited to see. I feel like we could find better ways. I feel like Fortnite's out one of those options.
True. We gotta give a shout out to Amico for hooking us up on Fortnite many moons ago, and now we get to talk football. So
sounds good.
There you go.
Certainly top 10. Top 10. We'll give it.
Yeah, that works. I'll take it. That's high praise from you. So before we begin with the quarterback conversation, I guess the first thing I wanted to sort of pick your brain about was just your general draft strategy. When are you big into the best ball right now, or is that something that how do you attack a whether it's draft or MFL 10s or whatever else? How are you attacking drafts right now?
You know, it's funny. I haven't actually done as many best balls as I normally would have done by this point. I was kind of hoping this week is going to be the week I get into it, knock 3 or 4 or 5 of them out, and kind of see how it goes. But my general draft strategy, and it seems counterintuitive, and I know that in the comments whenever I talk about it, everybody goes, "What are you talking about?" I'm kind of eschewing this running back early thing that everybody else is doing for several reasons. One, I mean, that's just my basic strategy in life. If everybody is doing one thing, it probably is a good decision to go and do something else.
Right.
But the other side of it is that people talk about the depth of wide receiver, and that's certainly true. I mean, you get to 55 and 60 in wide receiver rankings, like, yeah, fine with that person. So the depth is there. But there is a drop off from the elite guys to that group that runs, what is it, from the late teens all the way into like the 40s. And you think all these guys are pretty much the same. If you sit and make rankings, like those guys are pretty much the same. And so I actually think that the advantage here is going to be having those elite wide receivers, especially if you have lots of them, because everybody else has all of those same receivers. You're going to have that advantage. And then the third thing is we know what happens to running backs. Like I guess we forget every year what happens to running backs, but we know what happens to running backs. And maybe you hit on yours. And if that's the case, then awesome, right? Yeah. But you have a reasonable chance of taking a bunch of shots in the middle rounds when everybody else is taking those mediocre receivers and hitting on guys there as well. So you're not going to like your team whenever you leave. I promise you that. When you finish your draft, if you draft wide receivers early, you're going to hate your team. I understand if you don't want to play that way, that's fine. But I really like taking the wide receivers early.
Yeah, and I think we had Josh Hermsmeyer on last week, and he was saying pretty much the same thing as you're saying. I think we're seeing that to a certain extent already in the preseason, right? We already have seen the running back injuries pop up, and not to say that wide receivers can't get hurt, but sure, you have to play the numbers, and the odds are that the running backs are more likely to miss time. Pretty much no matter how you want to look at it, whether it's just, a couple missed games or larger chunks of time that they're missing every year. You avoided it last year and now you're like fully, I just have to go Todd Gurley. There's no reason not to, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to hold true always. So I'm definitely with you there. When you are doing best balls, sort of compared to like a traditional redraft league, is there a large difference in how you rank guys? Or do you sort of value people the same, no matter which format, assuming it's like a PPR format, let's say?
Sure. I'm a tier drafter, so I don't really draft on ranks anyway. I draft on tiers. And so I would say that when I'm in best balls, I certainly, with within tiers. And then I target certain different tiers. When I tier a guy, I'm tiering him because they're similar players, right? I'm not going to tier Tyler Lockett with Mohamed Sanu, something like that. So I'm certainly looking at different tiers, especially late in draft. I'm looking at guys who I think can pop for big weeks for sure. But I don't believe my rankings change all that much. And maybe that's different, but it's not. I guess it's because of the way I draft. Like I said, I don't draft via rankings. I draft by tiers. And so it kind of lends itself to doing really any kind of draft, auction included.
Yeah, I think there's a tendency that I see, and I probably fall into it sometimes too, but there's a tendency in best ball to sort of like really chase these high ceilings and not really build yourself much of a floor to fall back on, which, yeah, if you're in, the best ball championship in one of these huge field tournaments on draft, then of course you're going to need that. But I think if you're just doing like a regular, like 12-man league and you're just doing a fast draft, I think you do have to consider just some real like volume floor guys to sort of complement those high ceilings, because you can easily go a couple of weeks without really startable weeks if you're only out of your wide receivers, especially if you're only targeting a ceiling.
Yeah, and I think that's to that point when I was talking about the way I draft is that's what not being beholden to rankings. I have this guy ranked 28th and I have this guy ranked 29th. So I'm going to take the guy that's 28th. That's what that allows you to do, because if you have taken maybe some risky people earlier in the draft, you take Josh Gordon and you go, all right, well, I know the ceiling's there, but we don't know what the floor is. Well, then later on in the draft, and you could take, all right, I'm looking at whatever my tier is, tier 7, whatever. I could take the safer pick there, knowing that I have that upside. But if you ended up with Golden Tate instead of Josh Gordon, then you go the other direction. So it's kind of that idea. So I suppose but that should be for every draft. Like that doesn't really affect me in best ball. That should be the way you just draft. So I suppose I don't really draft that much differently in best ball.
Yeah. I always like bringing that up because I do think that there's obviously, like I said, there is a reason to do it in certain formats, but I think especially in a general sense, you should really be thinking about who you're pairing, especially within position groups, and sort of figuring out like, where am I going to get that floor and where am I getting that ceiling, instead of just saying like, these guys are going to catch bombs every week, because it's not going to happen most weeks.
Just Will Fuller, Tyler Lockett, you'll be ready, man.
Oh yeah, it's perfect. What could go wrong? All right, so let's. Why don't we hop into some quarterback strategy? As of last year, just real quick to sort of go through some results from last year. So win rates in draft, just from like a roster construction perspective, 2 quarterbacks on a roster and 3 quarterbacks on a roster accounted for almost 98% of the winning rosters from last season. Going with 4 or 5 was basically a death sentence. And I think I referenced it when I was talking to James Coe too, but there was actually 0.3% of rosters that won a league with 1 quarterback, which is pretty amazing. So
I almost won an MFL 10 last year with no quarterbacks.
Really?
Because both of mine were hurt. So if that had happened, I'm still talking about it. If that had happened, oh yeah, you would never hear the end of that.
It would have had to go in the Twitter bio or something.
Yeah, for sure.
So just a note there to sort of think about not going too crazy. And I think that is sort of a good transition into some of these sort of up in the air quarterback situations. When you're looking at say like a Cleveland, where we know Tyrod is going to be the starter week 1, but maybe Baker ends up supplanting him at some point. Or if you're looking at Arizona, there's a lot of the rookie situations, and just generally, how do you factor that into your decision? Are those types of quarterbacks, considering that we can't make roster moves, are those types of quarterbacks guys that you're just completely avoiding, or do you think there's some value in taking shots with guys like that?
Well, I think it depends on your roster construction and what you go into the draft and how you think you're going to do it. And then, you have to make your changes in the middle of the draft. If you didn't get the quality of quarterbacks. I think that taking Tyrod Taylor later in drafts, and I actually don't know where he's going in draft right now because it's been, like I said, it's been a month, I think, since I did a draft. But draft. They need to figure that one out. But it's been a little bit since I've done it. But he was going pretty late at least in June. And so if you were taking 3 quarterbacks, then putting him as one of your last ones and assuming, all right, maybe I only get 8 games from this guy, but he's worth so much more in those 8 games than anybody else that I can get around here. That makes sense. But if you're only going with 2 quarterbacks, that's just not an option for you. Those are guys that you have to avoid. And my primary way I like to build a roster, because I much rather would take a shot on the wide receivers on the running backs, is I'm not going to take 3 quarterbacks. It's just not going to be what I do. And so in that respect, yeah, I'm going to pretty much avoid those guys.
Yeah. As of recording right now, over the last 2 weeks on MFL 10's Tyrod, or did you see it was going around on Twitter yesterday? Apparently it's Tyrod. God, that was like a real sort of mind fuck. I couldn't wrap my head around that for a little bit yesterday, but he's going as QB 30 outside of the top 200 overall. So he is exactly free. Like and
that's the thing. Like if you were going to take and if you were going to take a shot on one of the guys, wouldn't he be the one? Like, I know that you're worried about Baker or whatever. They are adamant about what they're going to do here. And this is a coaching staff that was burned by Deshaun Kaiser last year. Now, Baker Mayfield, I think we would all agree, is a better prospect than Kaiser. But I'm taking them seriously here. So I don't think he starts all 16 by any stretch of the imagination. But if he starts 8 and he's free and you need a third quarterback for whatever reason, that's an interesting situation.
Yeah, and I think I've caught myself a couple of times sort of if I really do wait on quarterbacks, which we'll get into in a few, but I try to grab one of the top guys typically. But if we are waiting on quarterback in a best ball draft, I've been pairing him with like a Jameis Winston and then a third quarterback just because of the suspension. And then I know I'm sort of locked in, and I don't know that that's like the best thing in the world to do, and I'm not doing it everywhere. But when I did draft Jameis, I was like, oh, Tyrod's right there. Like, I know he's going to play the first few weeks and bridge that gap anyway. So if you are going 3 quarterbacks and you want to get, a share of Winston or one of these guys who you think might, be more valuable towards the end of the year than the beginning of the year, that's one way to attack it as well.
Or you could just take Baker and Tyrod and say, right, I've got that situation. And while we are worried about the coaching staff, maybe that's an understatement.
To put it lightly.
Yeah. But to have Todd Haley in there, that's at least somebody you can trust. You can trust Greg Williams to have a terrible defense. So there are some reasons that you would like that passing game. Obviously, Jarvis. We'll see what happens with Gordon and Njoku. So if you just want the Browns passing game, like that's probably a pretty cheap option to get your quote unquote second quarterback. You have to spend a net extra roster spot on it, but it's there.
Right. Exactly. All right. So why don't we take a look at some of these top guys that are being drafted? So this year's a little interesting to me. A-Rod is kind of like in a tier of his own in drafts right now. He's going in the top 50 picks on average, and no other quarterback is going inside of the top 70. Now, obviously, that changes draft to draft. Like there's a pretty wide gap with where like Russ is going, where Deshaun Watson is going, and where Brady are going. Those 3 are sort of up there as well. But what are your thoughts on grabbing one of these like top 4 or 5 guys early in best ball drafts? Are you strictly going to be waiting, or do you think there's some value in getting some exposure to the top guys?
It depends on what you mean by wait, I suppose. I'm not going to have Aaron Rodgers on any of my teams, and that's sad because he's the best fantasy quarterback, and it's just the way it is, right? And so what are you going to do? I might have some Tom Brady, because if Tom Brady's second in my rankings, and I think that I don't believe the gap between he and Rodgers is as large as certainly the difference in their draft cost. And so I am interested in Brady at where he's going. But then after that, there are 6 guys in my mind that are are kind of that next tier. And if they didn't have questions surrounding them, you would think about them in the tier with at least Brady, probably not Rodgers, but at least Brady. And I really like to grab one of those 6 guys. And I can just wait. I can wait until we have 2 or 3 left and go on and get mine, or wait if I even want to get risky until we have 1 left and get those guys. So behind them, you have Russell Wilson, who, he's on the edge of that group for me, but there are a lot of questions in that offense that I don't think people are willing to admit to. But there are a lot of questions there, so he's not there for me. Behind that, you have Cam, you have Deshaun, you have Andrew Luck, you have Drew Brees, you have Carson Wentz, who I'm getting a little more nervous about, especially, we know regression's coming, but with that knee as well, I'm getting worried about him. You go lower than that, you have a few guys, but out of that group of 6, I want one of them. And if I can get one of those guys, I'm feeling pretty confident going into the year.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And speaking of Anthony Amico, he tweeted out recently he was looking at quarterbacks, and for the last 5 or so years in drafts, 40% of the 30-point games from quarterbacks came from the top 6 QBs drafted. So we are pretty good at deciding who's going to have that ceiling at quarterback. So I've been trying to grab one of those guys. And like I said, it really is draft dependent. Like right now, I'm looking at MFL 10 stuff. Russell Wilson is going anywhere from pick 26 to 102. Like Deshaun Watson is going anywhere from 24 to 103, and Brady's going anywhere from 19 to 105. So if you're seeing these guys start to slip, then there's definitely value in grabbing one of them late, obviously. And I'm with you too. I'm never going to have Aaron Rodgers. I'm not paying that price unless let's put it this way. Where would you draft him? Like, where would he have to fall to, do you think? Like, what's the first round you're considering a quarterback if he's falling?
If it was Rodgers and he fell into, let's say, the 5th round of a 12-team league, that probably would be when I have to go, all right, I have to at least consider this, because I do think there's a difference. I do think that there is a gap. But then again, if Aaron Rodgers falls into the 5th round, then I can be pretty sure that Brady is going to fall even further. And so it creates like this domino effect where where I'm still probably not going to have him on my team. But in the 5th round, I think you kind of have to start considering him.
Yeah. Yeah. I've been waiting until I see Rodgers, Wilson, and Watson go off the board, which is typically the order that I've been seeing. Obviously, it changes a little bit draft to draft, but that's like a pretty safe bet for most drafts. And then like you said, that's when I'm sort of like, okay, I should be considering, if I see 1 or 2 more guys come off, like grab that last out of those 6 and hope to grab some of those 30-point games. So you did mention, so you have Rodgers up top. I think almost everybody does. Once you get past the Cam sort of, Cam, Brees, Brady, those guys, who are you thinking like in the middle? So like out of those, I don't know, I guess you would put like Cousins in there, Stafford, maybe Garoppolo, Roethlisberger, Rivers, like that sort of, if you're not waiting all the way until the end of a draft, how are you viewing those guys, sort of that like middle tier?
Well, I know that people are very excited about Jimmy Garoppolo, and he's a player that I'm struggling to develop a strong opinion about, which tends to have me kind of shy away from him because I just don't think we know, right? We just don't know what he's going to be. Maybe he comes in and maybe he's just great, but I'm just kind of shying away from him. So after those kind of top guys that are coming off the board, I'm really looking at Cousins and Stafford. And Cousins is so interesting because I think nobody really thinks he's a great quarterback. And some people think that he's good. And some people think like he's such is there anybody that has a wider array of opinions about his ability as a quarterback than Kirk Cousins? Like it's such a weird guy, but in fantasy,
especially because there's no injury concern. There's no, like, it's just the spread of opinions on him is pretty wide, all things considered.
It's just so weird to me. But in fantasy, obviously, we don't care about that, right? We care about the offense and we care about how many points he's going to score. And if you go in and you kind of look at the situation, we all kind of agree that Adam Thielen and Stefan Diggs are top 15 wide receivers. And if we all kind of agree that that's the case, then don't we have to agree that Kirk Cousins should be a top 8 or 9 quarterback? And I actually went back and looked at it. In the past 10 years, 25 offenses have supported 2 top 18 receivers. So that's a wide receiver 1 and then the top half of the wide receiver 2 range, which we would be surprised if those 2 guys don't finish in that range, I think. Yeah. 18 of those had at least a top 8 quarterback. And then a 19th was Chicago in 2013, where if you combine Jay Cutler and Josh McCown's score, it would have been the QB4. So, like, there's a really good track record that says Kirk Cousins is going to be a top 8 quarterback. Now, that's what you're paying for in most cases. Right. But if I'm trying to take somebody out of that second range, if I for some reason miss out on those guys that I'm targeting, yeah, he's going to be really high on the list. And then to Stafford, I don't know what else Stafford needs to do to prove himself. Since Jim Bob Cooter has shown up, he's been a quarterback 1. That's been what he's been. Since the bye in 2015, he's averaged 274 yards, 1.8 touchdowns, and 0.6 interceptions per game. That's been what he's been. So, like, I don't know why we're down on him every year, but he would certainly be the next on that list.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. And you can get him, meaning Stafford, in like easily the 10th in a lot of drafts, which is insane for like we're talking about, like, especially, and can obviously throw touchdowns in bunches too. So why he's lasting that long is a little confusing. I would love to hear your thoughts on Mariota too. I think that depending on who you talk to, he's another guy who has a pretty large swing where you're either people are making every excuse in the book for him for last season and just pointing to the previous year on how well he can perform. And I'm personally a fan of Mariota. I like him a lot. But you also have people who are just like, he regressed, he's done, he looked terrible last year. He's not the guy we thought he was. What are your thoughts on Mariota?
Well, it's funny because Mariota's answer to my question, who has the wider spread, or at least as wide a spread as Kirk Cousins, right? So that's interesting. I kind of look at him just from a statistical perspective. I think that he's a good quarterback. I think last year the deck was because of Decker. The deck was pretty strongly stacked against him. So I think he's a good player, but that's not even really important to me. I think if you look at his first 2 years and then last year, it's pretty clear to see that regression is coming, and it was coming even before the coaching change, right? He went from throwing a touchdown on 5.5% of his passes in his first 2 seasons to 2.9% of the time last year. We know that number regresses to the average. It happens every year. And I actually did a series of articles at RotoWorld over the summer. I called it alternate history, where I said, all right, if these guys just played to their career rate averages, what would have been the scores last year? And Mariota obviously shut up the list. But if you just take his first 2 years and use those averages, he'd have thrown for 210 more yards, 4.6 fewer interceptions, and 11.9 more touchdowns. Like, that's a massive number. And so I think that you look at that and you go, all right, regression was coming. And then, by the way, he got an amazing coaching change with Matt LaFleur, who has been under Sean McVay, under Kyle Shanahan, going to come in and we would assume run similar kind of scheme. We get that coming in there. Yeah, I mean, everything points to him just being a much better fantasy player and probably real life player this year.
Yeah, definitely. And currently he's going at like QB 15, which I would imagine you would have to consider his floor, right? Like, unless something drastic happened, I can't really imagine a story where I could tell myself that he's going to finish outside of the top 15 at quarterback. And
he finished 18th in 15 games last year,
right?
In about as bad as a year he could have, right?
Right, exactly.
Now, last year was a down year for quarterbacks. So perhaps maybe his floor is a little lower than that. But yeah, I'm really happy. And in non-MFLs, if you're just taking Fantasy Football Calculator ADP, he's actually going 17th behind Jared Goff and just ahead of Derek Carr, behind Patrick Mahomes. Like, that's value.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, well, you just mentioned a couple more guys. So out of, I feel like that's sort of this group now where we're getting to the point where you can sort of draft a quarterback in the first 7 rounds maybe and feel pretty good about who you locked in. And then, I mean, I find myself, even though I'm sort of a Stafford guy, I like him quite a bit. I found myself drafting Rivers a little bit as well. I think now we're getting to the point where you're either waiting super long and sort of hitting that like your backup QB and just banking on most of your weeks coming from the top guy that you drafted. Carr obviously is an interesting case. It appears that Gruden is going to do everything that he can to ruin the Raiders, just sort of in general. But do you think Carr can sort of overcome that? He has a couple new weapons. Looks like Lynch is sort of doing his old thing again. Hopefully that offense can take a step forward. Do you have any, are you going to have any Carr shares?
No, he's just not like, he's not the kind of quarterback that I'm interested in by any stretch of the imagination. I probably have Matt Ryan a lot lower than other people this year because of those types of guys. If you're going to come in and say that this is a guy who is going to get me 20 rushing yards, right? Those types of guys have to have special passing seasons to really jump into that upper echelon. And they can be fine for you, right? They can be fine for you, but they're not going to jump into that upper tier. And I think if you're taking a quarterback late, that's the reason you're taking them late, because you're trying to bank on upside. You're trying to bank on a guy that's not going to perform where they're being taken, but it's going to get past that. And I just don't think Derek Carr is that person just because of the quarterback he is. The offense, I'm not sold on. I mean, Amari, you would assume he has to have a better year than he had last year. He just has to, right? But Jordy, is he done? Like everything you look at with Jordy's efficiency numbers last year, you can blame the quarterback. Devontae Adams was able to do it with the quarterback. And everything you look at with his efficiency numbers, especially down the field where he's been so dominant throughout his career, it's not pretty. It just isn't pretty. So I'm just not sold on him. And like I said, he's not the type of quarterback that I'm interested in targeting.
Right. So sort of the opposite situation would be Mahomes, where we just think the weapons are so great there. In Hill, they added Watkins, they have Kelsey, obviously Hunt in the backfield. He's going at quarterback 18 right now. And he's sort of another guy where, like, if you just watch, even if you just see a few of his throws, it seems like he has all the talent in the world. I'm tending to believe that that's probably his floor pretty safely, and I would probably have him a little bit higher than that. But what are your thoughts with Mahomes?
Yeah, I think he is the kind of guy that you should be targeting back here. I know that people are getting really excited about him, and I understand it. You watch him uncork a throw, and you say, "Wow!" Right? I will say, you watch Josh Allen uncork a throw, you also say, "Wow!" So
I know I was pretty upset with how like amazed I was at that. I mean, it ended up being like completed out of bounds, but I was like, "Wow!" You have to admire shit like that, because it's just not everybody can do that.
Exactly, it's crazy. So I'm not putting much in that. I have seen. I was actually just reading a great piece today on Arrowhead Pride about some of the improvements he's made in his footwork. I do think that he might be bad for the Chiefs this year, and that he's going to turn the ball over more than Alex Smith did, which the turnover battle is so important for wins and losses, that the Chiefs might actually lose more games than we expect them to, which interestingly enough would actually be good for his fantasy prospects. Right. So yeah, I agree with you. If you're taking somebody late, that's the guy you should be taking, especially with the weapons that are around him. I mean, the weapons around him are among the best in the league, if not the best in the league. And to get the quarterback that's going to be orchestrating that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and obviously he's super cheap, so you're not really spending a ton to get a piece of that offense, which makes sense also. And for as much as the hype is sort of, I mean, it not starting, like it started really in the preseason last year, where some people were talking about, him like hopefully supplanting Alex Smith. You can still get him outside of the top 100 in every draft. Like over the past 2.5 weeks on MFL 10s, he's never gone in the top 100, and he's somewhere around like the 11-12 turn. give or take. So that's a pretty good price for a guy who has that, offense around him. So we've talked about, is there anybody else that you want to sort of plant your flag on for guys that you're either very interested in or very opposed to having on your teams this year?
Well, I'm all positive, 100% positive all the time. So I'll talk about Dak Prescott, who I'm confused by what's going on with Dak Prescott. What happened was he had 24 games to start his career in which he was really, really good. Then he had 8 games at the end of last season in which his starting running back was suspended for 6 of them, and his starting left tackle was hurt for a few of them as well, and he had a really bad finish to the season. And for some reason, we've decided that the 8 games at the end of the season are more important to his future projection than the 24 games before that. And I know that people are talking about his receiving core. Do you really think his receiving core is that much worse than it was last year? If it even, Des Bryant still doesn't have a job. Like, he might get one this week with the Browns, but he doesn't have one. Jason Witten's in a booth. Like,
yeah.
Did they really lose that much? I think Michael Gallup is a player. I think he's a very good receiver. I'm excited to get him. If Allen Hurns can stay healthy, he's a good receiver. I don't think that they're as devoid of weapons as maybe the people think they do. And I certainly don't think the drop-off from last year is as high as it was. And oh, by the way, he's getting Ezekiel Elliott back. And over the first 8 games last year with Ezekiel Elliott, he was on pace for 3,636 yards, 32 touchdowns, and 8 interceptions. Like, I don't get it. Maybe it doesn't happen. Maybe the last 8 games last year were indicative of who he's going to be moving forward. But even if that's true, you don't really have to pay that much to get him. I don't understand why you wouldn't take Dak Prescott, if I'm being honest with you.
Yeah, and again, just even if you're just talking about price, like his ADP is quarterback 20. Like, he's falling on average to outside of the top 150 overall in MFL 10s right now, and sometimes lasting till the 200s. So, if you want to go early on a guy and just completely wait until the very end of a draft, there's definitely an argument to be made there. As a Giants fan, I do need to get your take on Eli, because I think it's almost, not to the same extent, obviously, but it's a similar argument to, if you have these great weapons, theoretically, this guy has to do somewhat well, right? Like, you're talking about a top 3 wide receiver. You're talking about a tight end who is going as a top 5 tight end right now, and you're talking about a first-round running back. So the fact that he's going all the way at QB 26, something has to be wrong, right? So yeah. What do you think is wrong? Do you think the offense is not as good as we think it is, or do you think how do you decide in a situation like that?
Yeah, that one's a really tough one, because I've spent much of this talking about how we're overreacting to a bad season, right? Like, I just spent the last 4 minutes talking about that. So you can't overreact to Eli's last season. What I would say is that, first of all, Eli's age is a lot different than a guy like Marcus Mariota, Dak Prescott. He is in what we would imagine would be the decline phase, and so that changes a bit of the calculus. The other thing I would say is that this is a multi-year downturn. It's not just last season. People think, oh, they made the playoffs in 2016. He played well. He didn't play well. No. They made the playoffs despite Eli Manning, and so to go in and say, all right, well, it was a 1 year. No, it's been a 2-year thing. But all of that aside, there's a good chance he's washed. Like, there's a good chance he's done. But all of that aside, you're right. He's throwing to Odell Beckham, to Evan Ingram, to Saquon Barkley, and to Sterling Shepard. Like, that's a great situation for him to be throwing to. And you're getting him, like you said, the 28th quarterback? Yeah. Like, I would rather have Eli Manning than Derek Carr. I would. And you could get him for quite a bit cheaper.
That makes sense. It's not necessarily, excuse me, a quarterback question, but how are you viewing that sort of situation too? Because I've been going back and forth between either Ingram is being like way overdrafted, because like, how can they, like, most of his production last year came with no Odell and some without Shepard, and obviously Barkley wasn't there either. But do you think Ingram can pay off at his price at all? Or do you think that it's probably a situation where he's being overdrafted? And this is just because I'm a Giants fan. I'm
sure.
I just wanted to hijack it away from quarterbacks.
Sounds good. I think he's being overdrafted. But I think he's being overdrafted because you look at what he did last year, and he was a rookie, and he was a rookie tight end, which is the hardest position to make the transition. You can ask, you ask any football coach, and I bet that they'll tell you that tight end is the hardest position to make the transition. Yeah. So this has to be taken with a grain of salt. But if you look at his points per opportunity last year, it was bad. Like, he was down in like the Ben Watson like range of tight ends. Like, it wasn't good. He made up for that because he got a lot of opportunities. Right. But now you mentioned it. Saquon's there. We have Odell back. Sterling Shepard, who really wasn't right for most of the year last year, and he was benefiting from that. Now he's in there, and you would expect him to get a pretty decent target share looking at Shermer's history a little bit. So I think that he's being overdrafted. I don't think he's being like crazily overdrafted. I would take some other guys ahead of him. I would take Greg Olsen ahead of him. I take Delaney Walker. If we're talking about Titans regression, then Delaney Walker is item A in that case. So I would take some guys ahead of him. And I think that he's still a top 7, top 8 tight end, depending on how you're looking at the situation. But he's being a little bit overdrafted for my likes. And I'll have someone else from that tier on my team, most likely.
Gotcha. All right. And just to wrap up, I did put a tweet out earlier, and somebody asked a couple of questions, but they weren't quarterback questions, but we can hit them here anyway. Because I would like your take on the Seattle backfield. So this is sort of a 2-part question for me. So just in general, what's your feel for the Seattle backfield? Do you think that Carson is actually going to be the guy for any extended period of time, or do you think it's just Pete Carroll being Pete Carroll?
Well, I don't think anybody is going to be the guy in the backfield. And if someone is going to be the guy in the backfield, I would think it's going to be Penny. Although I believe he left practice today or yesterday, so that's certainly something to watch, but we'll have to keep an eye on it. But Pete Carroll has spent every waking moment this offseason talking about competition. He believes that competition is the reason they were successful when they were successful, and they gutted their defense in order to introduce more competition. If that is his philosophy, and in fact, I believe he said this week that players change, philosophies don't. So if that's his philosophy, then you have to believe that what's happening here is real. You have to believe that what's happening here is that Chris Carson is playing better than Penny, who's apparently struggling in pass protection, although Schottenheimer says is getting better, and that what's happening here is real. The other side of that, though, is if what's happening here is real, it still means it's just a timeshare. Because if you look at what happened when Russell Wilson was on the field in the first preseason game, yes, Chris Carson started and played the first 4 plays, but Rashad Penny was in on the next 4. One of those was a false start. And I believe that if you count the penalty, Russell Wilson played, off the top of my head, I think 13 plays, and that Carson was in on 7 and Penny was in on 6. So the best case scenario here for Carson is that they're in a timeshare if both of them are healthy. And if you're going to say, all right, could actually emerge as the lead guy? Well, the answer, I think it has to be Penny, but because Chris Carson, A, was bad last year, aside from that, we don't want to remember that. And B, that Penny has that pedigree. So if I'm looking at this situation, I think it's going to be a timeshare. I think Penny is very overvalued. I think that Carson is a good pick right now. But if those ADPs start to converge, then that calculus kind of changes a little bit.
Yeah. And then sort of the second part, obviously this isn't really as much of a best ball question because although, I don't know, maybe I'll just get your take on it. So drafting guys from the same backfield, so like handcuffing in a redraft or just taking, both guys in best ball. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm against handcuffing just in general. I don't like handcuffing. It's different in best ball because you don't have the waiver wire. So it is different in best ball, especially if you get in those deep leagues, like you get in those 28 round FFL leagues or whatever, then handcuffing becomes something that I'm more interested in doing. Taking from the same backfield, if it's a good running game, I'm fine with. If you know that their running game is going to be good, if you know that their backfield is going to score a lot of points. If you're New England and you know that in the Bill Belichick era, New England has averaged 17.7 rushing touchdowns a season, you say, all right, if I have two of those backs, I'm fine with it because I'm probably going to get 60 or 70% of that rushing touchdown production. And that's awesome, right? That's better than what I might be able to get. But if you're trying to get two backs off of Detroit's roster, that's different, right? So it's a case-by-case basis for me. If it's a good running game, if I think that running game can be very productive, then absolutely. But, it's case-by-case.
Yeah, I agree. And just like a public service announcement, if you're drafting like backup running backs in a redraft league so that you can try to like trade with your friends, just don't do that either. Just don't draft to trade. Just don't do it.
Draft players that can help your team without an injury. That's what you should be doing.
Yes, exactly. All right, Raymond. Well, thanks for hopping on with me today. I really appreciate it. Again, you can find him on Twitter at RM Summerlin, but judging by the fact that he's the first checkmarked person that's ever come on the show with me, I think you're probably following him already. So
it's a fallacious checkmark. It doesn't count.
So yeah, make sure you're following along with him on Twitter and all the stuff that he's doing over at RotoWorld. Make sure that you're following me on Twitter at MattJonesTFR. And thanks again, man. Appreciate it.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. See ya.